Welcome to Bahá'í Books and Authors, a podcast which introduces to you writers and the works they've penned related to the Bahá'í Faith. We'll explore the inspiration, the process, and the stories behind their work. I'm your host, Jan Grammer. This podcast is produced by World Unity Media, which also produces Bahá'í audiobooks. We're exploring a work that speaks directly to one of the most urgent moral challenges of our time, racism, and does so through the lens of unity, spiritual principle, and collective action. Illumined by Oneness, Resources and Reflections from a Multifaith Dialogue on Overcoming Racism, produced by the Baha'is of the United States Office of Public Affairs, brings together voices from across faith traditions in a profound and honest dialogue on how racism can be confronted and ultimately overcome. Rather than offering quick answers, Illumined by Oneness invites deep reflection. It asks what it truly means to see humanity as one, and how spiritual principles such as justice, love, and the inherent nobility of every human being can move us from dialogue to transformation. Rooted in experience and collective learning, this book challenges us not only to examine society, but to examine ourselves. P.J. Andrews and Selvia Daikalam Zabihi join us to discuss their collaboration on this profound and very important book. PJ is the Director of Public Discourse at the Office of Public Affairs of the Baha'is of the United States. Selvi is its Economic Justice Officer. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jan, for having us. I really look forward to the opportunity to talk about this book today.
Thanks, Jan. It's great to be here with you.
Let's begin at the beginning. PJ, how did the idea for a dialogue on faith and race first emerge?
In 2017, there was a moment of racial reckoning, so to speak. It was coming in the heart of what was a rash of killing of African Americans across the country, and often by police. It was bringing to the surface an ongoing generational struggle with racism in a very ugly way. Our office thinks about how to contribute to national conversations of social import in ways that are constructive and unifying and that bring the teachings of the Baha'i faith to bear and the principles that underlie this religion. Our office is really focused on building relationships with civil society, with government, and with social actors outside of the Baha'i community. The way that our office functions is we try and bring people together to explore some of the deeper root causes to these social issues, and tries to bring together people to think about how we can start to imagine different ways of understanding human behavior and human nature, and also human purpose. We thought one way in which our office could contribute to this conversation was to ask a question of the faith community. Our office is based in Washington, D.C., and there's a lot of national faith-based organizations here in the city that represent faith communities at a national level, especially from a policy or advocacy level. And they were very much engaged in this discourse on police brutality and police reform. But we felt that there was something that we could offer to these organizations that would be a space of deeper reflection on the heart of these issues. The question, and we often try and organize our gatherings around a question that can be an object of learning, something that we're learning about together, was what is the role that religion and faith communities can play in overcoming racism? We started it totally as an experiment. We just had one session, but we got such a positive response from the participants that we decided to take it up on a quarterly basis. And the way that we structured the gathering was both relational and energized content. We felt that if you're going to talk about religion and race, you need to be able to create an environment where people feel safe to be able to share freely. When thinking about how to structure the gathering, we wanted to emphasize bringing people together to break bread. We always hold them in the morning, so they're breakfasts. And then we opened up with an open space where people could share whatever was on their hearts. You might say empty their cup. And then we would move into a discussion paper that our office would prepare that helped guide the conversation. So it wasn't just a random conversation, but really on a theme that we felt was emerging in the discourse on race, and to really create a space to have a guided conversation that would increase the level of constructiveness to it. And then we always ended with discussion questions, and to really make it a participatory thing, that it wasn't something our office was bringing or telling, but our office was creating an environment where deep questions could be explored on equal footing among the participants.
How did the next step come of creating Illumined by Oneness?
We saw it as a project, and it lasted for about 5 or 6 years, from 2017 to 2023. It culminated in a statement that distilled all of the insights from our time together, which is in the book. We had sort of hoped that the dialogue would continue, but for whatever reason, it had almost come to a sort of a natural close. What we felt was that the richness of the discussion papers and the discussions that we had were worthy of sharing. We had had experiences where people had reached out to us who had heard about this dialogue and asked for the materials, and then they used the materials in community settings and they found them very effective. So that gave us, again, further impetus that we said, we should publish this. We also felt that it would be actually helpful to put this on a website where you could download all of the discussion papers, the framing documents, the discussion parameters to help set up the space well for a constructive conversation, so that people could have these conversations in their own communities and use material that had been tested through experience to have a difficult conversation in a constructive context.
Selvi, why is it important to take a multi-faith approach to addressing racism?
I think I would answer that question first by answering why it's important to bring in a religious perspective on addressing racism. The question there has to do, in a way, with the secularization of public discourse and how it's become hard to talk about, let's say, shared values, that values and religious commitments are seen as privately belonging to individuals or maybe belonging to particular groups, but not so much something that we think and talk about on a national scale. And addressing racism in America, there are many, many layers to it, and some of them are very deep, and some of them are deeply about our relationships with each other. And then certainly, of course, there are all the dimensions of that have to do with the institutions of society and the structures of society. So there are these very many different levels, and it's not at all clear that we can address it adequately without delving very deeply into questions of values and what we, in a Baha'i perspective, call spiritual principle. These are truths about being human in this world and living together that religions throughout the centuries have explored very deeply in their sacred writings, but also in the efforts of adherents to put those writings into practice. And there are very many commonalities across religions in those areas. When we created the distillation of insights, we made an effort to ensure that participants all felt a sense of resonance or identification with it, that it felt like home to many different participants from different religious backgrounds.
PJ, how does the book frame racism as personal, systemic, or spiritual?
One of the ways in which we've tried to talk about racism is that it functions at the individual, community, and institutional level. One of the things that we were trying to get at was this tension that we had noticed in the discourse on race, that oftentimes when religions were sort of seen to be addressing questions of racism, it was a matter of interpersonal dynamics. And of course, religion is very relational. So the orientation often was that this is a relational process and problem. But then when you would go into academia, it would say, well, that's a very naive perspective on addressing racism. It's actually a systemic issue. From our perspective as part of the Baha'i community, we really see it functions at both levels and beyond. So we tried to address it on multiple levels. One of the themes in the statement talked about a reconceptualization of power. That was a theme that we explored a lot, the issue of how we understand the way that power is structured in society. And again, it gets at one of those areas where it's a sort of a deeper issue that really needs to be explored when you think about how to address racism. Because I think that the traditional conception of power that exists in society is that it's zero sum, that to get power, somebody has to lose power. But when you bring a spiritual perspective to the concept of power, you can reimagine spiritual powers as limitless, that are belonging to the human spirit and just need to be tapped. So the power of love, the power of justice, the power of good and holy deeds. And these are things that we often learn from religion, and we learn from other places as well. They're sort of the moral fabric of life. But we really felt like it was important to drill down and understand how we think about power, and if we reconceptualize it around a spiritual foundation, how it might open up and unlock new ways of understanding how to overcome racism. Another theme that we talked a lot about was the relationship between unity and justice. Unity was often thought of as uniformity, as conforming to a dominant culture and erasing of diversity. Justice, I felt, was often conceived of either as a form of necessary vengeance or as basically a tool by which you destroyed injustice, so that the power of justice only had relevance in its opposition to injustice. We tried in our space to offer a much deeper and broader perspective of unity as through the lens of the oneness of humanity, that we're all connected spiritually and at a fundamental level, was a greater source of our identity than all of the things that made us different. But that also our differences were not sources of persistent prejudice, although we have been taught that they are. but that with a oneness orientation, the diversity of our existence generates a sort of richness and value much greater than we can ever imagine. Justice is a tool by which we can see truly and honestly the reality of the world, rather than as something that just is used to destroy injustice. The bottom line to your question is that I think one of the ways in which we tried to really emphasize how to define racism was essentially a spiritual and moral problem, that it warped our sense of our true identity and our true purpose as human beings, and that we had to sort of do some resetting around that.
How do you think racism then is a barrier to humanity's spiritual progress?
I think this book speaks to a vision into how we might imagine spirituality and morality driving a conversation on eliminating and overcoming racism.
Selvi, what practical role can faith communities realistically play today in advancing racial justice and unity?
It's a question, of course, that requires an individual to search themselves internally as they try to shed the habits of thought that are connected with racism, the categories, the assumptions, a sense of scarcity, or whatever the different things are that drive racism. And many of them are things that I think we only uncover layer by layer. And so there's the individual work that faith communities can certainly support, and then the collective work they might do within their communities. Also, importantly, what we hope to explore through the series and the publication was the contribution that faith communities can make more broadly to the national discourse and the national process of healing and overcoming racism. There's, of course, practical work that many communities do that's outward facing towards the wider society. And I think some of it is clearly seen as racial justice work, but there's also a lot of work that's important that isn't necessarily defined that way, but that does contribute to overcoming racism. So any sorts of efforts that help to overcome injustices of any kind because of the way injustices disproportionately affect certain racialized groups will be helping overcome racism by helping, with education or economic opportunities or health or any of those things. Also, there's a way that religious worldview helps us to be able to imagine beyond what's here and have faith in it and contribute to it, even sometimes sacrifice for it, like to make costly contributions to something that we can't yet see and that we can't even prove in any way right now is going to work out. And we still have to work very hard and maybe make large sacrifices to move in that direction. It's not that religious people are the only ones that can do that. Certainly, that's not the case. We can generalize that learning and that understanding and bring it deeply into a very broad national conversation. I would just add there's something in the book that can be helpful for people who might want to bring others together in a conversation. The sections of the book can be helpful in terms of the substance of the conversation. So you might want to take one of the other sections of the book and read it together. And there's questions at the end of each section that might shape your conversation afterwards.
How does the book, PJ, encourage or guide readers to move from reflection or understanding to meaningful action?
One of racism's greatest power is distance or proximity, that the way in which it's maintained is through keeping people across racial lines apart from each other to reinforce fear and lack of understanding. The best way to connect with someone, to sort of overcome prejudice, is to actually be in a relationship with them. To harken back to the purpose of this book, we see it more as a tool or a resource rather than a book. The point of it is to encourage people to have difficult conversations about challenging issues that our country is facing and that we face in the way that we interact with each other. When relationship is the goal, conversation is action. And so I think that there is a way in which the process itself of bringing people together to have meaningful conversations about challenging questions in an uplifting environment is an incredible capacity that our society desperately needs right now. There's something about the resource piece of the book, that the capacity building of bringing people together, that we feel is an incredibly important and profound form of action in this moment for this country.
Selvi, if listeners take away one new thought, one new practice from Illumined by Oneness, what do you think it should be and why?
One thought about all of this that I do feel is very important is to go beyond the idea of getting rid of something bad and to lean into the project of building something new and good. We don't want the types of injustice and suffering that now show a racialized expression in our society to continue for anyone. So it's not that we want to be sort of racially proportionate in how injustice is distributed in society. We want to change society so that the oppression and the suffering and the injustice isn't experienced by anyone. And so it's a question not just of removing racism, but of thinking of a very different kind of society that we want to build. And religion is helpful. Religion has an imagination to it of good things and of how to build them.
PJ, I'd like to ask the same question of you. What do you hope listeners will take away, maybe that they can implement in their own lives?
If you work at something, and if you work at something in community with others and in a spirit of service, slowly but surely, that breaking of something that seemed impossible to get rid of will slowly break away and then building something new. Yes, we do have to put in the blood, sweat, and tears and energy to move out the old structures that seem so heavy. But when we work together, we can really open the door to a new way. And I think that this dialogue experience, the experience that we had, which was truly multi-faith, interracial, men and women, young and old, coming together to have a really uplifting and energizing conversation about a very challenging issue that people tend to avoid because of its emotionally charged nature. There is proof in this dialogue that another way to address racism, it's possible. We really just encourage any reader to explore the material and think about how they might use it in their own lives.
Thank you so much. As we close today's conversation, we're reminded that this work is not simply a book to be read. It's an invitation to see more clearly, to listen more deeply, and to act more courageously. Real change begins when reflection turns into resolve and then into action. It's a journey that's made in our communities, our institutions, and in our own hearts. Thank you so much, PJ and Selby, for being with us today.
Thank you for having us. It was a joy to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for the questions and the interest in the book. It was really lovely to have this conversation.
Illumined by Oneness, Resources and Reflections from a Multi-Faith Dialogue on Overcoming Racism, produced by the Baha'is of the United States Office of Public Affairs, is available on BahaiBookstore.com or wherever you get your distribution services. Subscribe or follow Baha'i Books and Authors on your chosen podcast platform.